It started with something so small that most people would have missed it. Early one morning, just after sunrise, you stepped into the backyard carrying a cup of coffee. The air was still cool. A thin layer of dew clung to the grass. Somewhere beyond the fence, a sprinkler clicked softly in the distance. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. The old maple near the corner of the yard, the weathered fence post beside the gate, the familiar patch of sunlight slowly stretching across the lawn. Nothing seemed different, and yet, something felt different. At first, you couldn't explain why. Then you noticed the crow. It was standing on the fence post. Not moving. Not calling. Just watching. The same place it always seemed to be. You glanced away for a moment, taking a sip of coffee. When you looked back, it was still there. Head tilted slightly. Dark eyes fixed on the yard below as if studying something invisible. You told yourself it was just a bird. Just another ordinary morning. But then your attention drifted toward a flower pot near the porch. A flower pot you had moved the previous afternoon. Only 3 feet from where it had sat for years. Nothing important. Nothing dramatic. Yet somehow the crow was no longer looking at the yard. It was looking directly at that pot. And for reasons you couldn't quite explain, a small feeling settled somewhere in the back of your mind. The kind of feeling that arrives before a thought does. If you're new here, subscribe before you leave, because what you're about to discover may change the way you look at every crow that visits your yard. Because the strange thing wasn't that the crow noticed the change. The strange thing was how quickly it noticed it. And what happened next would make you wonder whether that bird had been studying your yard far longer than you ever realized. You have probably experienced something like this before, even if you never gave it much thought. A chair moved a few feet across the patio. A new planter appeared beside the steps. A branch that had hung over the fence for years was suddenly gone after a storm. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of changes that slip quietly into the background of daily life. Sometimes days pass before you fully notice them. Sometimes weeks. Human attention has a way of settling into routine. We stop seeing what remains familiar. We move through the same spaces every morning, following the same paths, opening the same gate, hearing the same birds in the same trees. And after a while, the details begin to blur together. That morning, standing in the cool sunlight with the crow still perched on the fence post, you may have recognized a feeling that is difficult to describe. Not fear, not even surprise. More like the strange awareness that something has been paying closer attention than you have. The crow eventually lifted its wings and drifted toward the maple tree near the back corner of the yard. The movement was silent, deliberate. It landed on a branch where it could see almost everything at once. The porch, the lawn, the gate, the flower pot you had moved the day before. And somehow that felt significant. Most people have had moments like this. Moments when they step outside and feel as though the world is quietly observing them back. A deer standing motionless at the edge of a field. A hawk circling overhead at exactly the right moment. A crow appearing on the same rooftop day after day. You tell yourself it is coincidence. Usually, that explanation feels sufficient. But every now and then, something lingers. A small question that refuses to leave. And this is where things begin to shift. Because the more closely you watch, the harder it becomes to believe that these small observations are happening by accident alone. Over the next few days, you begin noticing things that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary mornings. The crow does not simply arrive. It arrives from a specific direction. It pauses on the same section of fence. It spends a few moments on the maple branch before moving somewhere else. At first, these behaviors seem random. Then you realize they are not random at all. They are consistent. The branch is always the same branch. The fence post is always the same fence post. Even the route through the yard rarely changes. One morning, you stand quietly near the porch and watch as the crow lands on the highest point of the fence. It remains there for nearly a minute, turning its head slowly from side to side. The gate, the flower bed, the roofline, the large oak tree beyond the neighboring yard. It is not searching. It is checking. There is a difference. Something about that realization feels difficult to ignore. Most people assume animals experience places the way we do, as scenery, a collection of objects that happen to share the same space. But what if that is not what is happening here? What if every branch, every shadow, every opening between the trees means something specific? What if the yard you see as one place exists as hundreds of separate landmarks inside another mind? Standing there in the morning light, you begin to sense a hidden layer beneath the familiar landscape. The yard feels larger somehow. Not physically larger, but deeper, as though invisible pathways and reference points have been woven through it for years without your knowledge. And the more you watch, the more one possibility begins to emerge. The crow is not merely visiting this place. It seems to know it, in ways that are precise, in ways that are quiet, in ways that suggest a level of attention most people never imagine, and that is where the mystery begins to deepen. The more time you spend watching, the less mysterious it begins to seem, and somehow, the more remarkable it becomes. One quiet morning, the crow returns to the maple branch just as the first sunlight reaches the top of the fence. The air is still. A light breeze moves through the leaves, barely enough to notice. Yet the bird immediately turns toward a narrow opening between two shrubs near the back of the yard. It pauses there for a few seconds before moving on. And that small moment brings us to something researchers have spent years trying to understand. Crows possess an extraordinary form of spatial memory. They do not simply recognize places, they remember relationships between places, landmarks, distances, routes, tiny changes within familiar environments. In controlled studies, crows have demonstrated the ability to recall locations and navigate complex surroundings with a level of precision that continues to surprise scientists. But standing in your backyard, those findings feel less like science and more like observation. Because suddenly you begin noticing the same thing. The crow rarely hesitates. It moves through the yard with the confidence of something that already knows where everything belongs. The gate is not just a gate. The fence is not just a fence. The maple tree is not simply a tree. Each one seems to function as a reference point in a larger pattern that remains mostly invisible to human eyes. And perhaps that is why the bird appeared so interested in the flower pot you moved. To you, it was a decoration shifted a few feet across the patio. To the crow, it may have been a change inside a landscape it had already memorized. Something about that feels worth sitting with. Because if a bird can quietly build such a detailed understanding of a place through years of observation, it raises a much deeper question. What else might it be noticing that you have not yet seen yourself? As the days pass, something subtle begins to happen. Not in the yard itself, but in the way you move through it. You find yourself looking toward the fence before you even step outside. Your eyes drift automatically to the maple tree. The morning routine remains the same, yet there is now a quiet expectation woven into it. One morning, the crow is already there, perched on the same branch, dark against the pale sky. Another morning, it waits on the fence post beside the gate. The locations change slightly, but the presence feels familiar, almost predictable. And that familiarity begins to create something unexpected. Not ownership, not control. Something gentler than that. Recognition. The kind that forms when two lives occupy the same space long enough to become part of each other's routine. One cool morning, you pause halfway across the yard. The grass is damp beneath your shoes. Sunlight filters through the leaves in thin bands of gold. The crow watches from above. It does not leave. It does not approach. It simply remains where it is. For a few seconds, neither of you moves. And in that small stillness, a thought quietly arrives. Perhaps the bird is not only familiar with the yard. Perhaps it is familiar with you. Researchers often talk about memory and observation, but standing there, those words feel strangely incomplete. Because memory sounds mechanical, this feels different, more personal. The crow seems to expect certain things. The opening of the gate, the sound of footsteps on the patio, the appearance of a familiar figure carrying coffee into the morning light. Small details, repeated thousands of times. And maybe that is how meaningful connections form, not through dramatic moments, but through ordinary mornings that quietly repeat until one day you realize you have become part of the landscape in someone else's world. Then something begins to change. Not all at once. Not in a way dramatic enough to notice immediately. It starts with timing. One morning you wake earlier than usual. The sky is still gray. The neighborhood remains quiet. No lawnmowers. No distant traffic. Just the faint rustle of leaves moving in the pre-dawn air. As you step toward the window, you see a familiar silhouette already waiting on the fence. Another morning, you stay inside longer than normal. Yet when you finally walk into the yard, the bird appears within minutes, gliding down from somewhere beyond the trees as though it had anticipated your arrival. You tell yourself there must be a simple explanation, and perhaps there is. But the pattern continues. Days become weeks. The yard begins to feel less like a collection of objects and more like a living network of relationships. The maple tree relates to the fence. The fence relates to the gate. The gate relates to the narrow path leading from the porch. And somehow, your own movements seem woven into that network as well. The bird adjusts when things change. It notices when a chair remains out of place. It notices when a branch falls after heavy rain. It notices when a section of lawn grows taller than the rest. But what feels most remarkable is how quickly these changes seem to register. Almost as though the entire landscape exists inside an ongoing mental picture that is constantly being updated. Standing there one evening beneath the fading gold light, you begin to wonder if the real mystery was never about memory at all. Maybe memory is only the beginning. Maybe what you are witnessing is something closer to awareness. A quiet monitoring of patterns unfolding day after day. And if that is true, then a far more interesting question begins to emerge. What happens when the bird notices a change before you do? The answer may be simpler than it first appears, and at the same time far more profound. A few mornings later, you step outside and immediately sense that something feels different. You cannot identify it at first. The yard looks the same. The gate is closed. The flower beds are untouched. The maple leaves move gently in the breeze. Yet there is a faint feeling of irregularity hanging in the air. Then you notice the bird. It is not on the fence. It is not on the branch where it usually waits. Instead, it sits higher, near the top of the oak tree beyond the property line, watching a distant corner of the neighborhood. The behavior seems unusual. By afternoon, a utility crew arrives on the next street. Bright trucks, new equipment, temporary barriers, activity that had not been there the day before. Perhaps the bird noticed unfamiliar movement hours before you did. Perhaps it recognized a disruption in a pattern that had remained stable for months. Many people believe moments like these carry a deeper meaning, not because the bird possesses supernatural knowledge, but because it reminds us how much information exists beyond our conscious awareness. Something about this feels difficult to ignore. Human beings experience it too. You walk into a room and immediately feel that something has changed. You meet someone and sense trust before a single word is spoken. You choose a different route home without fully knowing why. Later, you discover there was a reason. Whether spiritual or scientific, these experiences seem to emerge from countless tiny observations gathered beneath awareness. Standing quietly in the fading afternoon light, you begin to wonder if the bird and the human mind are not as different as they appear. Both may be listening to patterns. Both may be tracking details too subtle to describe. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that neither always knows exactly how it knows. That evening, you remain outside longer than usual. The sun has already dropped below the rooftops, leaving only a soft amber glow resting along the tops of the trees. The air feels different at this hour. Slower. The neighborhood sounds begin to fade one by one until all that remains is the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird settling in for the night. The yard has not changed. The fence is still there. The gate still opens with the same familiar sound. The maple tree still casts the same long shadow across the grass. Yet somehow none of it feels quite as ordinary as it once did. You find yourself looking at the space differently now, not as a collection of objects, but as a place layered with memory. Every branch holds a history of arrivals and departures. Every corner contains patterns repeated so many times they have become invisible. The crow appears one final time before dusk, landing quietly near the highest branch of the maple. It remains there only for a moment, long enough to survey the fading landscape, long enough to become part of the stillness itself. Then it lifts into the evening sky and disappears beyond the neighboring trees. You watch until it is gone, and in the silence that follows, a realization begins to settle. Perhaps awareness is not something that suddenly appears. Perhaps it is something built slowly, through attention, through thousands of small observations gathered over months and years. The same way paths form through a forest when enough footsteps pass over them. Standing there in the growing darkness, you begin to sense that the world may be far more attentive than it seems. And maybe the most meaningful things are not hidden from us at all. Maybe they have been quietly present the entire time, waiting for us to finally notice them. The next morning, you step into the yard once again. The same gate, the same fence, the same stretch of grass still glistening beneath the early light. Nothing has changed, and yet everything feels different. Weeks ago, This was simply a familiar place, a space you passed through without much thought. But now, as you stand quietly beneath the maple tree, you cannot help but sense the countless layers hidden beneath what appears ordinary. The flower pot you moved, the branch where the bird often waited, the narrow opening between the shrubs. Small details that once seemed insignificant now feel connected somehow, like pieces of a larger picture that was always there. The realization arrives gently. Perhaps the most remarkable thing was never the bird itself. Perhaps it was the reminder that attention changes what we see, that awareness deepens the world around us, that many of the things we call intuition may simply be patterns gathered patiently over time, waiting for the moment we finally notice them. Whether spiritual or scientific, something about that feels difficult to ignore. Because the bird was never separate from the landscape. It was part of it. And over time, so were you. Thank you for staying until the very end and sharing this quiet journey. If you enjoy stories like this, stories that invite us to look a little closer at the world we thought we already understood, consider subscribing before you leave, because there are still so many things out there that most of us have never truly seen. And perhaps that is the real mystery. Not that the world is hiding its secrets from us, but that it has been revealing them all along in small, patient ways. Somewhere outside tonight, beneath a streetlight, on a rooftop, or high in the branches of a tree, a bird may still be watching a familiar landscape, quietly updating a map only it can see. And maybe, in its own way, you are doing exactly the same thing. Maybe it was only a bird, but somehow, it never felt like only a bird.